Hello and welcome to Therapy Chat with Phoenix Behavioural Health. I am Dr. Dawn Parks, and with me is Christine DesLauriers, LICSW and substance and addiction specialist. Today we're going to continue on our discussion about the personality disorders. There are 10 of them. We've talked about cluster A and C, and today we're going to finish up with cluster B. It's a fairly big cluster. There are 4 types in this section. So if we don't finish today, we'll definitely pick up and finish at our next session. Remembering that with the personality disorders, although they all may seem quite different, they do have some commonalities. The commonalities being that there is a rigidity of thinking or distorted thinking. There are typically issues with emotions and managing emotional states. There's often some impulse control issues, and often we see interpersonal issues, relationships at work or with family. So today our cluster B is known as the dramatic/emotional cluster, and those include antisocial personality disorder, narcissistic, histrionic, and borderline personality. So let's start with antisocial personality disorder. And often to get the diagnosis of, actually always to get the diagnosis of antisocial personality disorder, we need to see a prior diagnosis of oppositional defiant / conduct disorder, where we see these symptoms beginning before the age of 15. So those include issues with aggression, perhaps violence, oppositional defiance with adults. We're talking about children here. So with authority figures, there's a lot of arguing, possibly fighting as well. And it's not just in one place. It's at home, it can be at school, it can be in the community. And so a child will typically get that diagnosis, and if those issues continue to go on, and they don't always, but if they do continue to go on, and the child is now 18, we can look at the diagnosis of antisocial personality disorder. So, Christine, let's start with talking about the presentation of someone who may meet these criteria. And we can also see that we have a graphic up right now that talks about some of those things. The first one being failure to obey laws, norms, usually engaging in criminal activity. So when we see someone, often there is some kind of at the intake we're talking about some kind of criminal involvement or DUIs, or the client may be on probation, but has some kind of history involving those kinds of things.
Yes, this population is kind of your jail population. It affects men 5 times more frequently than women. It's impulse control, it's a general level of irritability and kind of aggressiveness. There's a sort of a disregard for other people. There's a manipulative quality often to their behaviors. There's deceitfulness. And as you mentioned, these types of behaviors impact their family life, their social life, and often their work life and finances. And often there's no remorse. You don't see much remorse. There's usually a lot of rationalization for why they did what they did, and you don't see them feeling sorry for that. It's almost kind of goes into the sociopathic sort of realm.
Yeah, and so we often see that even though someone who falls into this category may not have that ability to experience those emotions and those feelings of remorse, regret, they're very good at mimicking. So they can be in a crowd and they can watch the emotional expressions of others and put that on, and they're very good at doing that. And so when needed, for example, they are standing in front of the judge, they can be quite convincing in looking very remorseful and very regretful and putting on that emotion. But the issue is they don't really feel that emotion. When we look at the graphic too, we have besides the legal issues and the lying and deception, we see the impulsivity as well. Not too good at, well, when needed they can plan, but often we see this sudden change where a lot of actions are taken on pure impulse.
Yeah. Right. Yes. And as you see sometimes, if they get stress levels go up, the impulse and the aggressive behaviors will come out too. Sometimes that comes out in more of a maybe a work or a public kind of forum. If they're coming in for an appointment and they're stressed about perhaps a court date and they have to wait in line and they're not immediately attended to, they can become kind of explosive in the waiting room, things like that.
That's the irritability and aggression. Disregard for safety. So we often see this population involved in a lot of high-risk activities, and sometimes not calculated high risk, but just crazy high risk. A pattern of irresponsibility in relationships, and disregard for others' safety as well.
Correct. Yeah.
So, and as you can see on the graphic, the other criteria is that the person needs to be at least 18. Conduct disorder was present by history before the age of 15, and when a therapist is, putting together all of this information, they're also going to be careful to make sure that none of these behaviors are because of schizophrenia or bipolar disorder.
You don't have a lot of success with this population. With a lot of the personality disorders, depending on how high end they are, you don't really move them too much. The needle doesn't move. With someone with antisocial personality, I find that my goal is really to keep them out of trouble. I don't really think I'm going to change their thinking or their behaviors dramatically, because they're pretty ingrained, and they're not even willing to look at changing. Oftentimes they're coming to therapy because they're mandated. So really the goal is, can we keep things in check, and can we have you maybe do a little forward thinking when you start to feel impulsive or stressed, or like you're going to possibly explode, or you're going to want to commit a criminal act. Can we sort of look at the consequences and maybe pull ourselves back a little bit? Because often that's the piece that they're not doing. They're not looking at the full consequences. They're just acting very impulsively at the moment. And especially for this group, something like CBT, where we are looking more at the thinking and the logic, can be very helpful, because an emotionally focused approach might not work with a population who is not really emotional. In fact, this category, we do see a lot of reports and research that shows that their pulse rate, heart rate tends to stay very, very low. If anyone can beat the lie detector, we say this is this population, because they don't have those emotional kind of keyed in reactions that other people would have. So they tend to have a very low resting heart rate even under stress.
So moving on to the next personality, we see histrionic. The histrionic is, you know that movie Gone with the Wind, Scarlet? I'm paraphrasing. Histrionic. Very, very emotional and very attention-seeking. Often someone who is a histrionic personality it cannot be missed in a crowd because they're the one who really wants to stand out. So it may be a really unusual hairstyle or clothes that really are different, and they like that attention. It's always seeking attention, and everything is 1,000 times worse than any other thing that ever happened. So there's a lot of drama. We say there's a lot of drama with histrionic. So when we look at the graphic that's up now, at least 5 of the following traits are needed to diagnose someone who is histrionic. So the number one thing is this compulsion almost to be at the center of everything that's happening. So wherever we are, whatever we're doing, I'm at the center of what's happening. Inappropriate sexual, seductive, or provocative behavior with others. Emotions are a lot of emotions, but they're kind of more surface emotions, so they're changing. So within a few minutes, we could be crying and then laughing and then angry, and just very. We see a whole dimension. This group tends to use their body and their clothing to attract others' attention a lot more than an average person. And they're very dramatic, either in the content of what they're saying or in just the expression. Maybe the arms are all over the place. Maybe the voice is very, very loud, but just very, very out there. Actually, it makes you think perhaps of theater. They would be great on the stage. When we're talking about the personality disorders, and I think we mentioned this probably a few times now, that we're talking about an excess and a deficit. So the number one thing with all of these personality disorders is that what is the excess and how could we use it in a way that is not harmful and that could be productive. So for example, someone with histrionic personality may do great on stage and on the theater, and it would be a way to get all of that expressed. Often this population too is very easily influenced.
Yes.
By others and situations and what's going on, and they can very easily assume that a relationship is deeper than it actually is. So, I spoke to you twice and now we're best friends. And that those assumptions can often get that person into more challenging or even disappointing situations.
It's also predominantly affects females.
Yeah.
The last personality disorder we talked about, the antisocial, was predominantly males. Have occurs about 5 times more in males, and this is about 4 or 5 times more in females. The histrionic. So, you do see a lot of sort of flirtatious behavior, sexualized behavior with them, and as you said, center of attention, very dramatic, and usually when you're dealing with them, it's all sorts of drama going on. So,
and they can be uncomfortable being alone. But that excessive emotion, that tendency to shift emotion all the time, can actually become a problem in potentially closer or intimate relationships. Often this population is very fearful of being alone. Needs a lot of people around them and needs to know that they are the center of attention, and if not, they are vulnerable as far as being becoming depressed. Okay, so that's a histrionic. Moving on to narcissistic. Narcissistic. Let's look at, we have a graphic up for narcissistic, which shows quite a list here. Biggest thing that defines narcissistic is that big need for admiration, which we just saw in histrionic, but there's also a big lack of empathy. But unlike the antisocial personality, there tends not to be the aggression part of that. But looking at some of the criteria, number one, grandiose sense of self-importance. What's your experience been in working with people in this category?
Well, I think it's important first to realize that there's two types of narcissists. There's overt and covert. And I think people don't really think of the covert narcissist very much because they're focused on what they see as the overt type. The overt, usually you can pick that up within a very short time of dealing with that person because they very much are tooting their own horn. They're very much, well, I will say in general, narcissists tend to be very charming. They're very intelligent. And so initially you can be a little bit captivated by them, especially the covert ones. But the overt can be more bullying. They expect you to sort of go along and admire them, and if you call them on anything or disagree with them on anything, they can be very nasty and bullying and emotionally or verbally abusive. They are usually very successful. They gravitate to a lot of high-powered jobs. You'll see a lot of them in politics. You'll see them also in acting. Those professions tend to attract a lot of narcissism. They must have a sort of a supply, a feed of attention, and that's what they look for in relationships as well. The covert is much more insidious. It's someone who is probably, you're not going to recognize it. Covert is often referred to as a shy narcissist as well. So a lot of even though they have the same characteristics as the overt, they are much more subtle about it. And it may take you a long time, months in a relationship with someone to see some of these things come out. And it's much more of a kind of a condescending attitude towards people. Sort of chinking at your self-esteem little by little in remarks that they make, a lot of gaslighting. And I find what's a commonality with both the overt and the covert is a lack of self-esteem. And even though they come across as very confident and inside they really lack all sorts of self-confidence, self-esteem. They're very, very fragile inside. They're kind of referred to often as the hollow chocolate Easter bunny, because when you look inside, there's nothing there.
Right. But they really do. They tend to attach to people who they feel already have some level of importance or power.
They have an innate ability to walk into a room and to assess it very accurately, and they will target people that they know are of value to them, that would have status that they know how to sort of sidle up to. And in relationships, they also tend to target people that are very empathetic. Because they will give them supply. They're usually very nurturing and caring, and things that the narcissist lacks, they will look for. And I think the important thing to remember with all narcissists is that in any interaction with them, whether it's social, romantic, job, you are nothing but an object to manipulate. And that's how they see you, and that's how they will interact with you. And when they've gotten everything they need to get from you, you're cast aside very brutally, usually.
And they can tend to really overvalue someone. I mean, way over the top, or switch to the opposite, and you're completely devalued. And again, the graphic fixation with fantasies of infinite success, brilliance, or beauty. A belief that they are exceptional and superior, probably better than everyone else, are very important, and they can be very arrogant. A desire for this continuous admiration, sense of entitlement. It can be very oppressive with no form of empathy. Resentment of others, or a belief that others are resentful toward them, and a lot of ego.
They're very sensitive to criticism.
Yes.
And they will react quite I don't know if you want to say aggressively or kind of very angrily if they're under criticism. And every that's image focused. Everything is image focused, and has to enhance them in some way. Every person in their environment has to serve a purpose to enhance them, or they're discarded.
So, moving on to borderline. Borderline personality is probably one of the most widely studied of the personality disorders, and it's probably one of the ones that we hear about quite a bit too. Probably the best way, one of the best ways to describe them is that there's such an intense and unstable issue with the emotions. That the emotions can go up and down, up and down. The person can feel just completely governed by their emotional states. So, if things are going great, they're very happy and good, and then the next thing you know, it's really intensely bad, the end of the world, and I'm depressive or potentially suicidal. We see a lot of suicidal ideation or cutting behaviors, and impulsive behaviors like binge eating, substance abuse, other eating disorders, etc.
People, I think, are put in like a black and white category with them. They're either all good or they're all bad, and there's a lot of drama around them. And as you said, sometimes that involves like suicidal attempts, but they don't really want to hurt themselves, but they want the attention from it. But unfortunately, sometimes that can go in a bad direction. So
the tendency, the black or white thinking, which can be another really, really great use of CBT, because we're looking at the dysfunctional thinking patterns, rigidity in thinking, but we're also, this would be a great opportunity also to use DBT skills and mindfulness interventions to help the person be able to manage the intensity of those emotions. Let's see.
I think I was going to say, I was just going to say unstable relationships. And sometimes there's some paranoia with that too, in terms of, which may not necessarily be reality based.
Right. Because often when you look at the history of relationships, there's a lot of very intense relationships, breakups, very kind of tempestuous types of relationships, and this overall sense of emptiness that a person will say, I don't know who I am. I don't really know how I feel. It's just like this darkness, this darkness. So I can fall into that, and that's when I get this intense need for attention through cutting or behaviors, for example, or other self-destructive behaviors. They can often be a big misinterpretation of others' intentions that can swing me back into a different type of more negative mood swing. I think that this population really has this feeling of loneliness and a difficulty connecting. So it may look on the outside that they are outgoing and talkative and have all these relationships, but they have this kind of this sense of feeling empty and not really being attached to
I think
anyone.
that's with all of these personality disorders. There's an inner depression,
Yeah.
and they look to medicate it through
Yeah.
compulsive relationships or substance abuse,
Right.
and they can never fill it, and they're never happy.
So we are just coming up to our 30 minutes. We're running out of time. So if anyone has any questions or would like to find more information about personality disorders or anything else, or would like us to discuss any specific behavioral health condition or issue, you can contact us at drparks@phoenixinfo.online. You can visit our website at phoenixinfo.online, or you can call us at 508-623-3931. Thank you for joining us today. We hope to meet with you next week.
Okay.
Thank you.